a conversation with Edward P. Jones, multi-award-winning short story writer and novelist. I am privileged to be joined by Haki Madhubuti, poet, publisher, man of all worlds, on this 2008 Hearts Day, sponsored by the Department of English at Howard University. Hearts Day is the day when we honor African American literature, its makers and transmitters. Mr. Jones is the 2008 honoree, as was Haki Madhubuti, the 2004 honoree. Three honoree of Hearts Day. There have been 14. And so today we are delighted to converse with the author about whom we have been talking all morning at this conference. And now he will talk and tell us that we've been all wrong. We are also celebrating on this Hearts Day the 100th centenary birthday anniversary of Richard Wright, ancestral author. And our conference has focused on the development of African American fiction, or developments in African American fiction, from Richard Wright to Edward P. Jones. And we've been talking about stunning matters. I told Mr. Jones that I have no questions for him, only kisses. However, an interview obliges me to ask questions. So I'll begin with one asked of Wright 48 years ago on the matter of black culture, black language. And Wright said, black culture will never be destroyed, and that one can speak of a black language in the United States, but when integration is completed, this linguistic situation may disappear.
Yeah, right.
So I'm asking you if you agree.
It's a really question I've never really even considered, because I always think of myself just as a plain storyteller. And I suppose as long as I have my faculties, as long as I'm able, then I'll be writing, and what I'll be writing about is black people and their black language. From the beginning, one of the things about black language that I always knew, one of the things is when I was reading Wright and other people early on in my teens, I was very struck by the fact that they used apostrophes whenever there were missing letters. And when I got around to doing it, I knew that I wasn't going to use apostrophes because it seemed almost that, and I suppose maybe the religion had something to do with it, that there was something missing in the language. You know, I'm going home as opposed to I'm going home. And my mother spoke like that, I'm going home, and I saw nothing wrong with that. So I've always never used apostrophes because there's nothing wrong with the way people speak.
Exactly. I love the way Miss Marie Delbo Wilson in Marie said, I want raised like that. It's very difficult sometimes to get the richness of the inflection down on the page, and you do it.
Yeah, well, I think the thing now is that there aren't a lot of people who speak that way anymore. You know, there aren't people who go around saying, you know, every goodbye ain't gone, every shut eye ain't seen. you know. And so when I use that sort of language, almost in my mother's voice, it's new because it's not been around for a long time. So I think that the problem comes with just memory. You know, the older you get, the more the memory fails you. I got, Mrs. Adams gave me a ride from my place here, and we passed places on Q Street, 11th Street that I remembered. And the problem down the line, if ever I think of a story, for example, of a woman who lives in the 1600 block of 11th Street, those buildings aren't there anymore. I'm talking about her living in the 1950s and the 1960s. So I have to remember what was on that street and what numbers there were. And that will become more and more of a problem as I go along. I've always, you know, tried to put people in the stories in a particular building with a particular number. It's as if a reader can go to that building and say so-and-so lived there. When Lost in the City came out, there was one for the city paper wanted to do an interview. We were driving around, and we passed the location of a story in Lost in the City, the store. That story takes place at 5th and Old Street, Northwest. When we drove up 5th Street, I noticed, because I had not been to that corner in years and years and years, that the building was torn down. And I was very struck by that, and I wondered if, living in Arlington where I created the story, if I would have been able to do that knowing the building wasn't there. Because in my imagination, the people went in and out of that store the way it was when I was a child. And the fact that the building was no longer there, I wondered if I could really create those people in my head the way I had in the story.
Well, I'm here because of Brother Jones. And I guess being honored by this, you know, great English department, a great university, myself, and I guess I've been to about 5 of these Hearts Days. But I come in today because of you and your work. And you have emerged not only as a significant writer, but a great writer. I don't want to embarrass you, but I'm really very serious about this. I haven't read your work, and when I lived here, and I lived in D.C. for 8 years, so I was teaching here at Howard, but I would commute every week, you know, so I do not know the city that well. But what has happened to me in reading your work, most certainly the latest book, it has essentially kind of reawakened this city in ways in which I don't think many people can do. And our parallels, and I don't want to put myself in your space at any level, but you read Native Son at 13, I read Richard Wright's White Boy at 14. And for me, Wright changed my life, you know, in terms of where I was going. I mean, being raised around among pimps and hoes, slamming Cadillac doors, and Lower East Side, Detroit, Michigan, West Side, Chicago. But there are other parallels also that are very critical in terms of the maturation of serious writers. I mean, your mother, being illiterate, and both of y'all become deeply impoverished. Your father leaves early. Same thing happened to me. You moved 18 times in 18 years. And I know we moved 16 times in 16 years. My mother died when I was 16 years old. Your sister, and bless her soul, just passed recently. I don't want to get into that, but you find yourself essentially writers and poets and people who are very serious about language. You know, I read your work and I think of Toni Morrison because she's a master of the language, and you also are a master of this language and the way we speak as a people. But I think I see in terms of your life, your work coming out of your experiences in this city and how the city has treated you at one level. But at the same time, how you've been able to not only survive and thrive and give us pictures of ourselves, but to really paint. We talk about, I was thinking about Clinton. You know how Clinton got mixed up around, talking about your former president with this is stuff? And they were talking about, well, what does is mean? What is you is you ain't my baby, all right? I think that the problem with language always is is that we have to have men like you, writers like you, to interpret, but at the same time put them in the spoken mouths of the people that this language represents. And you do that very well. And so with the 3 books that we have been able to read and to love and to reread and to study, there are other parallels in your life. I just want to mention one other. Gwendolyn Brooks, who was one of the finest poets of any generation, any culture. Very few people know this. But you could not call Gwendolyn Brooks during the time of soap operas. She would look at these soap operas all the time. All right? And then as I was researching your works, I see that you, and I don't want to, Judge Judy. Right?
They mentioned that one, but there are a lot. I've watched them all. I take them all.
And I think,
And you can zip through the commercials.
right, but I think that's highly significant in terms of how you take our world, the culture of our world. We don't see this. We don't see Judge Judy in your work. But what takes you away from the seriousness, the real seriousness, and the deep, and the other side, the way you treat women? And see, that's the problem with Richard Wright. I mean, Richard Wright, I love Richard Wright. But Richard Wright, as far as and correct me if I'm wrong, Miriam, Richard Wright never dealt with women the way you've dealt with women. In terms of multidimensional, you see, in all of its phases. But so, my question is, what would you credit, I mean, the major credit for your development as a fiction writer, as a novelist?
I don't know. I think maybe it was sort of what we hit on before this began, that I discovered reading pretty early on, and I think maybe if I were growing up now, I don't think I would have a chance. I think probably things in the street would have been calling me. I was a pretty shy kid. There wasn't after I was 12, 13 years old, I came home. And for the most part, when I wasn't watching television, I was reading.
Right.
And I got such a joy out of that, such a pleasure out of that, that nothing in the street could top that. And it just so happens, and I'm reading, maybe a sophomore or junior before the idea of being some sort of writer occurred to me. And it never occurred to me in any serious way. But I think that had I not discovered books, then maybe I would not have discovered that I might want to do this. There was a quote that I heard, and I don't, this guy's won the Nobel Prize Chicago writer.
Saul Bellow.
Yeah. I never read Bellow because it's hard reading. And I always feel that, you shouldn't really bore a reader like that. You should try to entertain, sentences should be simple and pure. But if I had not discovered books, then I would have not known, that maybe I could do this writing. Bellow said, talking about Bellow, I heard a quote from him several years ago, that writers are readers moved to emulation. And I think, that's what we did. We didn't know it when we were 13, 14 reading Richard Wright, that, we wanted to be writers because that was in our world.
Right.
Middle class people, especially middle class white kids, they grew up with their fathers, mothers bringing writers home for dinner every evening, doctors home every evening for dinner. That didn't happen with us, We didn't have those people we could look at and say, yeah, one day I want to be that. We did have books. And somewhere down the line, someone told us, when we started submitting stuff, you do this not badly. Why don't you follow up on it? And that's what happened to me, I think, that I discovered reading. And nowadays, maybe if I were a kid out there now, and most kids, of course, don't read. We have television with 300, 400 channels. Probably if I were a kid of today, I might not discover books. I might not be a writer.
Well, I think that's part of our responsibility today as writers, as poets, to make sure that we try to develop the conditions for, the environment for reading. It's very clear that we're not going to be able to emerge out of the 20th century if we can't function on a literate way. And I think that your books most certainly, as you know, I work at Chicago State, and we got the MFA program in creative writing, and our MFA is geared around Africana literature. And so your 3 books have entered the syllabus and the canon of the 100 books that these students have to read before they graduate. And if we are to move as a people, it seems to me that literature, reading has got to be like basketball. It's just, I just run in the street. If street culture was liberating, we've been free a long time ago.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you do, and I just want to that your stories are like folk tales at one level. They're urban folk tales that have been, I think, translated. Now, Brother Jones doesn't have a cell phone, all right? But I use this as now in terms of like they have, for us, I think, have moved into our cell numbers of those who are not afraid to grow. And you have to enter your literature unafraid to grow, because you. So my other question is this. You told me earlier today that you still sleep on the floor. People don't know this, all right?
Yeah.
I think this is quite profound. The riches that which he has been able to incur as a result of his work has not changed this man. And that's why we love him so much. And the work that he writes, the short stories and the novels, he could not have done that if he did not have one quality that is critical in terms of his work. He loves black people. Yes. He loves black people. Right. And I think that's why we're here, and that's why we celebrate you. And this love, where does it come from? I mean, because now we have these schools in Chicago, and we teach children at 2.5 years old to love themselves. Because most of us hate ourselves.
I think I haven't done much thinking about, how I began. But, it was Washington, D.C., and almost all the adults that I knew had come from the South. And they weren't crippled the way succeeding generations in the cities were crippled. They had a certain sturdiness about them. And in their own big ways and small ways, they sort of passed it on to their children. And I got a lot of that from my mother. I mean, she couldn't read or write, and job she had was washing dishes in a restaurant and cleaning rooms in hotels.
Right.
But she got up every day. She had first 3 kids to care for, and then 2 kids, and that was her duty. That was the center of her life. And I think that what it is that you sort of, my mother died in 75,
right.
And you don't want to, you don't want to do anything that would make your mother say, I'm ashamed of you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that, that should carry you on whether you're 40 or 50 or 60, all the way down. That's why 86-year-old Marie says, I wasn't raised that way.
I wasn't raised that way.
Because it's the foundation, it's a certain foundation that you have. And so all the people that I knew were black people, good people. I don't think I ever knew of anybody who was murdered when I was growing up. And if I saw a fight in the street, it was a big deal because it was a rarity. And people, I think the thing is that people struggle for little things. And out of that comes, when you see that, and when you grow up in that, you have a certain respect for them.
Yes.
And you can't get away from the fact that there are black people who are murderers. There are black people who are dope dealers. But there are black people out there who are saintly.
Yeah.
And so the job, if you're going to do the writing thing, is to tell the entire story. And even if you're dealing with somebody who's a murderer, that's not the totality of his life.
Well, we think you've done that. You have dealt with the entire story, but interestingly enough, you and Haki have talked about a question that was asked right also 48 years ago. And the question was, do you believe that our era of excessive mechanization or technology will destroy the human element and compromise artistic creation? Well, you've answered that question because you said no, and Miss Marie did it too because she spoke through a cassette, you know, in the last decades. Yeah, but there is a question, since you talked about womanhood in your literary imagination and in your life, and we talked about that this morning. I want to ask a question about manhood. Wright said that his character Fishbelly in The Long Dream, 1953, accepted the grand American narrative of manhood that is making money and satisfying his sexual needs. Do Moses and Henry Townsend in the known world fit that description?
Moses and Henry.
That,
Yeah, I think they're material people, which is why they're doomed in the end. And the nice thing about I always say that I'm not the best critic of my own work. And the nice thing about being out and about among people and being asked questions is that over time I've come to see certain things in the work that I didn't realize were there. But you know, you have a certain consciousness that works on a certain level when you're writing. And in the end, I think most of the people in the known world, there are people that sort of fall on either side. There are people who are lost because they don't have anybody. And that's certainly Moses. I mean, when you first see him, he's in love with this woman in the very beginning, early on in his life. And he's a different man from the man at the end of the book, a man without anybody. And his problem, his defeat comes when he decides essentially to throw away his family. He sends his wife and child into freedom, but it's not because he wants them to be free. He thinks that he can become the next Henry Townsend. The same thing with Henry Townsend. His problem, of course, is that his father, in a certain sense, is not Augustus, a good man, but William Robbins, the white slave owner. So he takes all that he knows about the world from that man. On the other hand, those people who have latched on to other people, who realize that you cannot go through the world alone, which Moses and Henry Townsend believe. Someone like Elias, for example, his only thing in the very beginning of the novel is to be free. And he runs away once, and he's caught, and they chop off part of his ear. And he is hostile. Now, had he maintained that forever, I think he would have been just as lost as Moses and Henry Townsend. But what happens is that this boy comes in with food and water, and through this boy he learns to love this woman. And the result is that he gains a certain freedom even before the Civil War arrives. I think most of the characters in that book are like that. Because I think
he marries Celeste, the heavenly woman.
Yeah, I think she's the most angelic person. I selected the name intentionally. But I think one of the saddest things about black people today is that, you know, there's a phrase at Maya Angelou about 30 years ago on Panorama, Channel 5 at noon. She was on there, and she says, there's a phrase, I don't know if it was one of her poems or someone else's, something about people being exiled to things. You know, I remember this Ricky Lake show about 15 years ago. There was a black woman on there, must have been about 22, had 3 or 4 kids. And she was talking about her children had everything. And then she ran off, they had Jordache, this, and this name brand this, and this name brand. Nothing about the books, nothing about love, nothing about education.
Right.
It was all about things.
But Haki, I hate to do like this, because I haven't been able to get this child out of my mind. You
By the way,
talk.
I just want to mention, talking about things, however nice this suit is, it was $25 at Goodwill.
That's the first thing he said to me when I walked in. I don't know if he was talking about me.
But you're not going to get me off this. And in the Smithsonian interview, someone asked you about the naming of your characters, and you talked about Moses and, you know, the inversion and stuff like that. I want to know, how did you get the most adorable character, the most adorable figuration that I've ever seen in American literature? As I said, since Little Brown Baby was walking out. How did you get the name of Elwood? It's so right. Baby Elwood.
Was rather accidental, I would think. That, I don't, when characters come to me, they have a certain life, even if I can give them names. The names come later. That's why when people talk to me, when we talked last week on the phone, you said Baby Elwood, I thought you were talking about a real kid.
You talked something.
He
He said, how are you? I said, I'm holding Baby Elwood. He thought
but so the people live before they have names. And when I did Lost in the City, I did all the stories, and I didn't want to stop when I had to think of names. I just put question marks. And then when all the stories were done, I took the DC phone book and would get a first name here and a last name there. Well, that took hours and hours. So I learned with the known world that you have to come up with a name right away. You know, you don't want to, wait at the end of a 400-page novel to come up with names. So I just would sort of, the computer was sitting on the kitchen table, and there might be an envelope or something, and the first letter I would see on the envelope, if I look to the side, might be an M or an A or something or other. Sometimes I would just begin at the beginning of the alphabet, A. Originally, Moses' name was Adolphus, and there was Adolphus, there was Alice, because I had to come up with names, and I started with the letter A. I think this name Elwood probably came, I probably was thinking maybe that particular day about where I was living when I went to grad school in Charlottesville. I lived on Ellwood Avenue. I suspect that's where it came from.
Baby Elwood. Haki, I'm giving it to you. That's just one thing. There's a legend that's grown up around here about Miss Jones.
Okay.
In an interview at the Smithsonian, at the question and answer period, a woman said to him, I wrote you a letter and to tell you about how much I love Lost in the City. And to my surprise, you called me on the phone to say thank you. Well, the next hand that went up was mine. And I said, Mr. Jones, I've also written you a letter. People said that. And he said, is your name Eleanor W? So it went around the whole room, and people said, and it's all out of this man knows all our names.
I thought you were going to say, do you always wear red? Bring it all the way up to all Aunt Hager's children, and looking at a rich man with this couple who had moved to retirement and to this tower, and she, the wife, Leonis, is that her proper? And of course Horace, her husband, he had told her, and she felt that they were going to renew their marriage in this move because they've given up a lot and so forth. Well, anyway, they moved to the building, and the exact opposite happened. You see, where during her short lifetime there, she dies there. They hardly even touch each other. Okay, and what happens is at 73 or so forth, after she had passed, I'm quoting you now, he realized two things after Lonnie's death. His own quote-unquote vitals had rejuvenated. He never had the problems other men had, though he had failed a few times along the way. But that was to be expected. Now, as he moved closer to his 73rd birthday, he felt himself becoming even stronger, ever more potent. God is a strange one, he thought, sipping Chivas Rica one night before he went out. He takes a man's wife and gives him a new place. And the other thing he realized was that he was more and more attracted to young women. Now, I read that passage because essentially he's talking about this rise and fall and how essentially men, particularly Horace, loses himself in these young women. And that the story is interesting, especially to a man my age, when you begin to realize that relationships have another meaning. Especially, my wife and I have been together since 1969. And I mean, the vital still exists, but you don't need to read this story to recognize how a man essentially moves toward these young women, and the young women are basically street. They street all the way. And he allows them to come into his house, and for the most part, it destroys them. You want to comment on that? Because does it reflect your own life at any level?
No, I think this is probably why I haven't done a whole lot of stories, is because I have to pull everything out of my imagination to make it all up. You know, if I were taking it from my life or someone's life that I know, you know, it'd be easy enough. All you have to do is sort of put them in a different street and give them a different name.
Yes, right.
But no, I think that you know, you're a storyteller. You know, it's about the drama. I was in Jackson, Mississippi, and it was after reading, and a young woman asked me, you know, it's about the known world. Essentially, you know, why can't there be a happier ending in people's lives? And I said, you know, there's nothing you can do about that. You're writing about, you know, human beings. And if everyone's life was wonderful, then no one would pick up the book. Essentially, you know, it's all about the hardships and everything. And, you know, I couldn't write a story about a happy marriage with this couple. Because I think in so many ways I'm a pessimistic person to begin with. And I'm not sure if I would be capable of writing something positive. You know what I mean? So yeah, it came out of that. I think it's sort of imagining a couple who've been together for so long, and they're in this one-bedroom apartment, and yet they live separate lives, you know, and they've gotten to the point where they're at each other's throats all the time, and it's very sad, very sad. And I think that for this man Horace, I think at the end, probably, if there were another page or 2 pages added to the story, he would come to realize that had he devoted himself more to his wife than what they could have had, he would have been saved.
I think that's the moral there in the story itself.
You talked about your work in naturalistic. I don't agree with you. You just said pessimistic. I don't agree with you. Certainly not naturalistic in the sense, I don't know, Jared, whether I'm doing this in the sense that we think of right as a naturalistic writer. Now, this is what I mean. Right referred to his character, Ishbel, as a human plant forced to grow and live under completely abusive conditions. And that was his view of that, a human plant forced to, and he said that was the terror of it, the terror of this boy's passage into work. But then Henry Dumas, a few years later, wrote, I am grown in America, blow Africa on me, and I become a rare and fabulous seed. And in your work, I think the plants have grown to be an oak. So, and something else happened. If they are naturalistic, they are naturalistic in the predetermined way of a God, surprise, surprise, in these days, because you claim your narrator as God. You say, I am the God of these people. And I think the difference that I'm noticing between the naturalism of right, if there is that, and your naturalism, or what you call naturalism, is that the people seen in the present, as Haki has said, of a loving God. And determining, I'm just using your word,
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think what she's on is important, but it seemed to me that Wright was ideologically pinned into his whole worldview and the type of struggles that he had to deal with, which also meant that he left the country for these very reasons. And so when we read Native Son or any Wright's work, let me say this, I may be incorrect. I do not see Brother Jones with a particular ideological or even political, quote unquote, point of view. And okay.
I don't think that I do. There's certain things that I believe, of course.
Mm-hmm.
As a black person, of course, slavery is wrong and there's no way around it. Now, when I sat down to write the novel, that wasn't the first thought or the 100th thought in my head. But because who I am, I could not write any text that someone could go to and say, yeah, on this page, on that page, we see he's pro-slavery. He's justifying slavery. The people I always think are just living simple lives. But beneath all of that, because of who I am, my beliefs can't help but be inserted in there somewhere. I think too that Wright sort of, he was born in the thick of racism in the South, then he went north and experienced even more of that. In Washington, we had our neighborhoods, and aside from maybe the person who ran the corner store, people on television, we never saw white people. We didn't, they were out there, but they didn't really, and our parents, had jobs, in the white world, but that was them. They might come home with stories, but still there was a sort of insulation from all of that. So we were not really in the thick of it. We lived in a world where, as I said, I was on 10th Street and we had 3 nice movie theaters on U Street, and in the early years there was a Howard Theater that was there, the Booker on U Street, the Republic, the Lincoln, fine theaters, nice clean theaters, We didn't need to, go to downtown to a white theater, sit in the balcony and sit in the back. We could sit anywhere we wanted on U Street. So we had a world where we didn't have to contend with all that, and that's because we were children, and our parents did.
That's right. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and I think I'm the only person in the world who will admit that I grew up on Auburn Avenue. So another comment of Wright in relation to what you have just said, Haki, and what you've just answered, Wright said that in 1960, that a black child cannot enter the American school system without being crucified. God.
That's the same thing today.
Do you agree?
Oh yeah, I mean, the reintroduction of apartheid within the public school systems in America is taken as fact now. I mean, look at D.C., I look at Chicago. And which brings us, again, why his stories and this novel is so important, because it brings us back to ourselves, that if there is any way to beat this, and regardless of what Obama does, all right, in the final analysis, we still got to deal with D.C., black D.C. We got to still deal with black Chicago. You see, that's not Iowa. Right? And we want him to do well. At least I want him to do well. But I still think that if we are to become whole people, we got to come through his work, just like we came through Wright's work. And I think that, for us, in terms of how African-centered pedagogy, is that first and foremost, we got to be grounded in ourselves in order to be able to deal with anybody else. You see, so coming through his work is critical in terms of the continued maturation and development of our people.
Exactly, that's the truth. But he came through, as he said, a school system in which he received Richard Wright.
Right.
So did I.
Right.
Because that school system then was different, would you agree, from now?
They had teachers who had gotten good educations, who were, of course, prevented from going to the outside world. So you had all these wonderful teachers in the DC school system. And I went off to college, among people who had private school education, public school education, and I did very well. You know, I was 150 out of 500, and that was, I'm talking about a DC public school education.
Yeah.
Um,
Difference between then and now.
Yeah, it's you know, I went to Mendoza, and one of the first times I went back there, you know, I'm in this guy's class talking about, I think it was Lost in the City. Kids are coming in late. One kid has his head on the desk sleeping. You know, I mean, when I was going, you know, it was just.
They didn't do their homework?
No, it was, you know, even the worst student in the class was a good student.
But we live in a time now where you have this freedom, and it really is the freedom to self-destruct.
Yeah.
And this is why I think at one point that we have to, this is why Howard is so important, regardless of the difficulties that we have in keeping it going. And I'm at Chicago State, and we have our own problems, which is it's a 90% black university. Is that Dr. Traylor and I and others, we made a choice to be here at these institutions because we see these young people as the answer. When we were coming up, most certainly in the 60s for me, young people changed the world. And young people will have to change the world again. You see, that's the hope. You know, forget these old people. All right? If you're 30, 35, 40 years old, I don't have anything to say to you. And this is why I think literature has got, each home has got to become a mini learning institution. Because obviously the schools are not working as they should. And so within the context of these homes and these mini learning institutions, at the center of each home has got to be a library. All right? That's why paperbacks are so important. But in terms of your work, and just like, what did your mother think about your work?
She never saw anything that I published because she died before any of that could happen. She was always one, of course, for us to get an education.
Right.
She didn't have an education, and she knew that was our way to salvation. But she was always supportive in her own way.
And so you actually wrote your first novel, World, in your head.
Yeah.
And so it came out, it was 10 years you were writing the novel in your head. And then you sit down and began to let it go out.
Yeah, it was 10 years because I thought that I would need to do research on American slavery. So I had the 40 books. And my plan was to read all of those books and then get down to the writing. Over those 10 years of not doing the research, I felt that I didn't deserve to do any writing until I read the books. So I just kept putting off the writing, you know, for that day when I would get down to reading all those books. But, you know, the creative mind, you know, wants to go its own way.
Right.
So even though I had not read the books, I was working the novel out in my head, thinking that, well, once the books are read, then I can go in and fill in those spaces and everything. After 10 years, I had not read any of the books, and I realized that the novel I was writing was there in my head, and all I had to do was write it. I think it was a strange thing about this, because once the idea for this writing about a black man who owned slaves, once the thing came to me, I didn't read any novels about slavery and didn't do any of the nonfiction reading. But I think that based on what people are telling me, you know, I have a sense that maybe there's some sort of channeling going on from people who are slaves, and somebody's coming down through the blood somewhere. I mean, you know, maybe it's something you were born with. You know, I think something's going on there. You know, and so I think probably had I read all those books, you know, I would have had all manner of facts and figures and everything. But I think the characters would have gotten lost in all of that. One of the things that I often read is a section of the novel dealing with Fern Elston, who was a school teacher, free woman, and her purchase of a runaway slave, Jebediah Dickinson. It's about 17 pages, and it comes far after the middle of the novel. Now, there's mention of horses and slaves and everything, but there's not a lot of stuff you would get doing research on that era. And I think that it worked my understanding of it is because essentially it's about these two human beings and what they do for and against each other. And I think that's the case of when you're writing any story, whether it's 5,000 years ago or whenever. If the characters aren't there front and center, then you can do all the research in the world and it won't work.
When there's a moment in that last story in North City, Miss Marie, who apparently I have just metamorphosed into, when she gets to that Social Security agency, she's been there 3 or 4 times, they've missed the rest of her. She sits there for 4 hours after her appointment time. She gets up and goes to the desk and asks that young woman when on earth, politely and nicely, they will see her. And that young woman says something to Miss Marie, and Miss Marie slaps her down. And I'm sitting there reading this story, and I stand up out of my chair, and I will swear in a court of law that I was hugging Marie Delbo Wilson in my arms, and she was there. I mean, I think that the stories and the novels, and I read this very difficult time in my life when I lost my own mother, and I read this through a whole season, got me through. They say yes, they could, and yes, they did. There was no trouble for me to say now, yes, we can. You know, I mean, those are the facts of those stories. I mean, it delivers over in a way that hasn't quite been noticed. It has happened in the African American novel. I'm talking about the novels particularly. It's happened, of course, all the way in the African American narrative. But it has not been noticed the absolute delight, the absolute wonder that the story achieves in its reader. You're the one who talks about the recreation of emotion. And how the emulation that you talk about is a desire to recreate what others have created in you. And I always think, in your case, from what you have said, I think it's your mother you're writing.
You know, I see part of that also, but I see also that for me, reading Brother Jones, that his narrative for me is a liberation narrative.
Of course.
And that he's free. And not only in terms of the mind, but most certainly now in terms of what he feels that he has to do as a writer. And this whole question around slavery as a moral contradiction, it has never been a moral contradiction for people who are making money off slavery.
Right.
I mean, it was a money contradiction.
Right.
I mean, it's a whole lot about economics at one level.
Right.
All right. And and what I see today, and I think is accurate, is that the enslavement of Africans, I mean, which is the root of our compass today, you see, that we're not functioning as a whole people today as a result of that. And we have to confront it ourselves. I mean, I don't need an apology, all right? But we need distance between that negative part of our lives in order to become back and become a whole people. And as a whole people, we have to confront this reality that you write about on the basis. I know it's not a question, but
I think, isn't Baby Elwood that reality?
Well, I think he's a part of this family that, you know, it's his mother, Celeste, and father, Elias. And they're slaves, but they have a certain cohesion.
Yeah.
Which is why at the end of the book I mentioned that, you know, that those Elias and Celeste, they go on to create a dynasty so that this woman, this imaginary woman in the late 20th century, is able to find out that every 97th person in Virginia is related by blood or marriage to them.
Yeah.
And that's their triumph over slavery, and had Elias continued to be the hostile person, fixated on wanting to be free, wanting to be away from everyone else, he never would have achieved that. He never would have found this woman. And of course, once he does find her, he's sort of stuck there because she is crippled and she can't run. But he goes, I think the thing is that without even knowing what I was interested in is and it's sort of, I couldn't remember the name of that song. It's a spiritual. I've often wondered how they got over.
My soul looks back and wonders.
And I couldn't find the title of anything else. But I think that on some sort of level, I was interested in that, and that the people who were able to find each other, whether it's family or friend or whatever. Stanford, for example.
Yes.
He's spent all of his life abusing women,
Right.
and he gets to the point where they're no longer attracted to him, and the only thing he can think about is suicide.
That's it.
But lo and behold, he finds a way out of that, with these kids and with Elwood down the line, and I think it was something, I think that a lot of things are sort of lost once black people came to the cities, there was a certain, I could just tell it in the way people talked about stories, growing up, my mother and all the adults that I knew. There was, it was hardship down there, of course, but there was something else, and I think it was probably because they were in this great sewer of racism, and so they had to cling to each other. Of course they did bad things to each other, but on the whole, they clung to each other, and they fed it, gave each other something.
The absolute magic character other than Elwood for me in the long run is Alice. Oh, that Alice is the mother to me. You don't have to say anything more about Alice. But Alice is just.
Yeah, it's again, when you're telling stories, the thing is that you don't want to go down any road that any other storyteller has gone down, and that's why there've been a lot of novels, of course, about white slave owners, and I remember from college that I heard that there were black slave owners, so I decided to do that. I didn't want to have. I knew that there had been a lot of black people who had escaped from slavery, but I had to find a way to do it in a new way, a different way. So I came up with this woman who was able to get the entire world to believe that she was insane. And so that insanity allows her freedom to go about and chart her way to freedom. It's amazing what the mind comes up when you have to.
Right. And when it's free enough to come up with it, being distinctive enough. And this is why I think that your literature, your work will be a part of the canon as long as we're reading. Because you found another pace, another world to write about. But it must be noted, rather emphatically that, black and slavery, they're not synonymous. That slavery existed throughout human history. We find ourselves here enslaved. But through 1840 in Manchester County, Virginia, you had, as you write, 2,191 enslaved Africans, 142 free Negroes, 939 whites, 136 Indians, most of them Cherokee or Chickasaw, and we're actually the majority. I suppose we spoke the same language and started organizing at one level. But again, the work is a similar work. I mean, all your work is. And what are you working on now?
Actually, nothing.
Just a few minutes for questions.
Yes. I have a question. I'm a little curious, by the way, about your understanding of your work as being pessimistic. I mean, if you take the Davis collection,
On Higgins too?
yeah. In the lead story, right?
Mhm.
It's terrible what you find out at the end,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But it's not tragic. I mean, the mother, attains freedom.
Yeah.
So this is my interpretation. It's a wonderful way, right, for her to come to terms with something that she couldn't do directly.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, right, in
Yeah.
a way, very optimistic. I also think, by the way, it's one thing. I also think that in a certain way, the only way, black folks are going to achieve freedom is when we have distilled, right, the horror of slavery into a very beautiful story. So we can look at it and remember it, something like that.
Because the problem is that we're getting further and there aren't any people around who remember it.
Yeah.
And when they were around, not enough people wrote down their stories. You have the Holocaust, you have untold numbers of books, and movies about that.
Oh, yeah.
And the same thing should have been done as far as American slavery. And it's unfortunate that it's not, even when I was growing up, my mother and all of her friends had this sort of thing about slavery where they didn't really want to talk about slavery because it was, something to be ashamed of. It wasn't something that, they had managed to survive. And that's unfortunate.
Well, what do you all think about the narratives of emancipated men and women who set the whole boat a-rocking as to what people call postmodern of all things, narration? Or post-colonial. They were post-colonial in the ethos, and they really negated, if you call someone a slave without their permission, you do so at your peril. These narrators were never enslaved in their minds, like Alice in your book. And that leads off in terms of the memory of slavery, don't you think? Those narratives of the 19th century, of the 17th century even.
When I was doing it, I was sort of conscious in certain ways. I didn't want to create any among the slaves, because originally my thought was just to write about the slaves that Henry Townsend owned. I didn't really care about any other characters.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I just wanted to write about simple, plain people, and that's what my mother was, and that's what I grew up knowing, that simple, plain people often do amazing things.
Yes, indeed. Question? Simple, plain people often do amazing things. In other words, the ordinary is the extraordinary in the fiction of Edward P. Jones and in the life of his people.
And I guess if you want, I was going to ask about again the music, how the music, has influenced your work. And I know we got to move on, but I get that.
Music. I don't listen to very much modern stuff anymore because I grew up with radio and they had Motown and all that. Songs that you can understand the words. Right. But I think probably, there are certain voices that you hear, and those are the voices that spoke with my mother, and then the songs that I remember hearing as a kid. Stories, stories.
Thank you.